Let me start with a simple question. What happens when an airplane lands itself? Not a pilot landing it, not a crew bringing it down carefully, wheels touching the runway, engines easing back. I mean an airplane with absolutely no one inside it. No pilot, no co-pilot, nobody at the controls at all, somehow coming down out of the sky on its own in one of the emptiest and most dangerous places on Earth and landing almost gently. And then sitting there, untouched, for 15 years. That is exactly what happened in November of 1958 when a small team of British geologists flying a survey plane over the deep interior of the Libyan desert, out past where any road goes, out past where any person ever really goes, looked down at the empty sand below them and saw something that made no sense. A large American bomber from the Second World War, broken in two pieces, but otherwise sitting there almost whole in a place that was hundreds of miles from anywhere a plane like this had any business being. When investigators finally made the long, difficult journey out to reach it, what they found was almost too strange to believe. This was a B-24 Liberator, a four-engine American heavy bomber that had vanished without a trace 15 years earlier, back in 1943, and the desert, dry and untouched, had preserved it like a museum piece. The machine guns still worked when you pulled the trigger. The radio still worked. There was a thermos of tea sitting in the wreckage, and after 15 years sitting in the desert heat, the tea inside it was still drinkable. It looked, in other words, exactly as if the crew had just stepped outside for a moment and were about to come right back. But they were never coming back, because there was no one in that airplane at all. 9 young American airmen had taken off in this very bomber back in 1943, and the plane had been sitting in this exact spot, perfectly preserved, completely empty the entire time. So where did 9 men go when their own airplane lands itself in one of the most remote deserts on the planet, and not one of them is anywhere to be found? It would take searchers another 2 years after that first discovery to finally answer that question. And when the answer came, it turned out to be one of the most remarkable stories of human endurance to come out of the entire Second World War. This is the story of the Lady Be Good. Let's set the scene properly, because the details here matter a great deal later on. It's the spring of 1943. The war in North Africa has turned in the Allies' favor, and American bombers are flying out of a string of rough, hastily built airfields scattered across the Libyan desert. Flat strips of cleared sand, really, more than proper airports. From these airfields, heavy bombers were striking targets across the Mediterranean Sea, hitting Italy and the parts of Europe still held by Germany and its allies. One of these airfields was near a place called Solich, not far from the coastal city of Benghazi in Libya. It was home to the 376th Bombardment Group, flying a type of American aircraft called the B-24 Liberator, a big, boxy, four-engine bomber. It wasn't graceful to look at, but it could fly a very long way, carrying a heavy load of bombs, which made it perfect for the kind of distant missions this unit was being asked to fly. One particular Liberator in this unit was brand new, fresh off the factory floor in America, flown across the Atlantic Ocean and handed over to this unit only in late March of 1943. Someone on the crew, following a common tradition of the time, painted a name on the nose of the plane, taken from a popular song everyone knew. They called her the Lady Be Good. And the men who would fly this brand new airplane were just as new as she was. They had only just arrived in Libya. They had trained together on the B-24 for a couple of weeks, no more. Not one of them, not a single man on this 9-person crew had ever flown an actual combat mission before. They were, in every sense of the word, rookies. Let me introduce them properly, because you'll want to remember a few of these names as we go. The pilot in command was First Lieutenant William Hatton, 26 years old, from New York. His co-pilot was Second Lieutenant Robert Toner, and Toner is a name I want you to remember above all the others, because he carried a small pocket diary with him in his flight suit. That little notebook would, years later, become the single most important piece of evidence in solving this entire mystery. The navigator, the man responsible for figuring out where the plane was and which direction to fly, was Second Lieutenant Dupe Hayes. The bombardier, the man who aimed and released the bombs, was Second Lieutenant John Warofka. And rounding out the crew were 5 enlisted men: flight engineer Harold Ripslinger, radio operator Robert Lamont, and 3 gunners, Guy Shelley, Vernon Moore, and Samuel Adams. 9 young Americans, a long way from home, about to fly their very first mission together. They had no particular reason to expect anything unusual. Thousands of young men were flying their first combat missions that same week all across the world. But this particular mission would end up killing every single one of them, and it would happen in a way that almost nobody on either side of the war could ever have predicted. Quick recap before we move forward. It's the 4th of April, 1943. 9 rookie airmen flying a brand new B-24 bomber called the Lady Be Good out of an airfield in Libya. Their target that day was the Italian port city of Naples. Naples was an important harbor for the German and Italian war effort, so the plan for this mission was substantial. 25 B-24 bombers from this unit would strike Naples harbor that afternoon, flying in 2 separate waves, 12 planes in the first wave, 13 in the second. The Lady Be Good was assigned to the second wave, and as it happened, she would end up being one of the very last planes to take off that day. Right from the start, the weather turned against them. As the bombers were getting ready to take off, a sandstorm kicked up across the desert airfield. And I should explain why that mattered so much. Sand is genuinely dangerous for airplane engines. It gets sucked in, it grinds against metal parts, it can choke an engine until it simply stops working properly. As the second wave of bombers climbed up into the sky, the sandstorm only got worse and visibility dropped sharply. One after another, planes in that formation, their engines clogged with sand, their pilots unable to see clearly enough to keep proper formation, gave up and turned back to base. 8 of the original 13 bombers in that second wave aborted the mission almost immediately. The Lady Be Good kept going. Maybe it was the determination of a brand new crew, eager to prove themselves on their very first mission. Maybe their engines, while they had swallowed some sand too, simply seemed to be running well enough to continue. Whatever the reason, the pilot, Lieutenant Hatton, decided to press on toward Naples. But by now, the formation he was flying with had been badly thinned out. Strong winds buffeted the remaining planes and scattered them even further apart. By the time the surviving bombers reached the area near Naples, evening was falling, and what had started as a formation of 25 planes had shrunk down to just 4. The Lady Be Good was at the very back of even that small remaining group, arriving over the target late in poor light as dusk turned into full darkness. And here, the mission simply fell apart. The other bombers had already come and gone. The light was failing fast. The target below was hard to make out clearly. Lieutenant Hatton, remember, this was his very first time flying over an enemy city, made the kind of careful, cautious decision that a responsible new commander might well make in that situation. He chose not to drop his bombs on Naples that evening. Instead, he turned the Lady Be Good around and began the long flight home. And somewhere over the Mediterranean Sea on the way back, the crew released their bombs into the open water below to lighten the plane for the journey ahead. In a way, this should have been a disappointing but perfectly survivable end to the day. A first mission that didn't quite go as planned. Frustrating, certainly, but nothing more than that. All they had to do now was fly south, back across the dark waters of the Mediterranean and land safely at their home airfield in Saluch. A few more hours in the air. That was all that stood between these 9 young men and their own beds that night. But the flight home is where everything went terribly, catastrophically wrong, because somewhere out there in the darkness, over the open sea, an invisible wind was quietly pushing the Lady Be Good toward a fate that not one person aboard that plane could possibly have imagined. Let's pause and get our bearings again, because this next part is the real heart of the mystery, and I want to walk through it carefully and clearly. It is now nighttime. the Lady Be Good is flying home, alone, high above a layer of cloud. That detail matters enormously, because flying above the clouds meant the crew could not see the ground, the sea, the coastline, or any landmark at all below them. They were flying entirely on their instruments, trusting their compass and their calculations to bring them safely home to a small airstrip in the desert. Up in that high, dark sky, something the crew could not see or feel was working against them, a powerful tailwind blowing from the north. This wind was pushing the Lady Be Good south much faster than anyone on board realized. The crew believed they were making ordinary, expected progress on their way home. In reality, that invisible wind was carrying them across the sky far more quickly than their calculations accounted for. They were covering the distance home much faster than they thought, and then, without anyone aboard realizing it, they simply kept going, right past home and out the other side. Then, the one piece of equipment that might have saved them stopped working. Just after midnight, the pilot, Lieutenant Hatton, got on the radio with a simple, urgent message. A piece of equipment called the ADF, short for Automatic Direction Finder, a device meant to point an airplane toward a radio signal coming from its home base, had broken down. Hatton needed help. He needed someone on the ground back at the airfield to tell him which direction to fly. A radio station on the coast at an airfield called Benina took what's called a bearing, essentially a compass direction pointing toward wherever the signal seemed to be coming from. The reading they sent back to Hatton was 330 degrees. And here is the small, almost unbelievable technical flaw that ended up dooming 9 men. The particular kind of radio antenna that ground station was using had one very specific weakness. It could not tell the difference between a signal coming from one direction and that exact same signal coming from the precise opposite direction. In simple terms, the bearing those operators sent back to the plane could have meant two completely different things. It could mean the Lady Be Good was still out over the sea, approaching the coast, just as everyone assumed, or, and this is the part nobody realized in time, the plane had already flown past that station and was now heading deep inland, away from the coast entirely. The Lady Be Good had already flown past the station. That powerful tailwind we talked about a moment ago had quietly carried the plane over the Libyan coastline, directly over their own home airfield and onward into the desert beyond. And neither the crew in the air nor the radio operators on the ground had any idea this had happened. To everyone involved, that 330-degree reading looked exactly like a plane that was still safely out over the water, getting closer to home. In truth, it was a plane that had already overshot home completely and was now flying at full speed straight into the most dangerous, empty stretch of land on the entire planet. The crew of the Lady Be Good believed the coastline was still ahead of them somewhere in the dark. They kept scanning the blackness below, looking for the welcoming lights of home. And the entire time, they were flying in exactly the wrong direction, south, away from the sea, away from any hope of rescue, deeper into the open Sahara desert. Every single minute they flew, they were getting farther from safety, while believing the whole time that they were getting closer. This is really the heart of the whole tragedy. There was no enemy fighter plane chasing them, no anti-aircraft fire, no battle of any kind. There was simply a wind they could not feel, and a single radio reading that could honestly be read two completely different ways. And on this one night, it was read the way that would cost them everything. If this story has you hooked so far, take just a moment to hit subscribe. It really does help stories like this one find more people who'd appreciate them. Now, let's follow the Lady Be Good as she keeps flying straight past the point where there was still any chance of turning back. Quick recap, so we're all on the same page. It's now sometime after midnight. The Lady Be Good has already flown right over her own home airfield without anyone realizing it, and she's now 2 hours deep into the open desert, with her crew still believing they're somewhere out over the sea. Down on the ground at the airfield, not knowing any of this, someone fired off flares, bright signal lights meant to help guide any lost aircraft home. The crew never saw them. They were flying above the clouds, eyes fixed forward, still searching for a coastline that was, by this point, hundreds of miles behind them. And they kept flying south for 2 more full hours. Think about what that really means for a moment. For 2 entire hours after they had already passed safety without knowing it, these 9 young men kept flying deeper and deeper into one of the most empty, lifeless regions on Earth. A vast stretch of open sand called the Calancio Sand Sea, the whole time believing the Mediterranean coastline was just over the horizon, just a little further ahead. With every passing minute, their situation was quietly becoming more and more hopeless, even though nothing visible around them had changed at all. At around 2 o'clock in the morning, the inevitable finally happened. The fuel simply ran out. The engines began to sputter and die, one after another. The Lady Be Good was somewhere around 7,000 feet above the pitch-black desert floor, and she was finished flying. Lieutenant Hatton gave the order to bail out, meaning each man would have to jump from the plane with a parachute. And here we see the final, heartbreaking consequence of that one mistaken radio reading from hours earlier. The crew believed right up until this very moment that they were jumping out somewhere near the coast, that they'd come down either in the water or close to land near the shore, where they could quickly be found. They had absolutely no idea that they were instead about to parachute into the middle of an enormous, empty desert, roughly 400 miles from the nearest help. One by one, in careful sequence, the men jumped out into the darkness. The bombardier went first. The pilot, Hatton, as a commanding officer should, jumped last of all. 8 of the 9 parachutes opened properly and carried their men safely down to the desert floor below. The 9th did not. Lieutenant John Warofka, the bombardier, suffered a parachute failure. His chute did not open the way it should have, and he fell to his death alone in the darkness. His crewmates would search for him and never find him. He would lie exactly where he landed, still in his flight suit, his failed parachute still attached to him, for the next 17 years. The other 8 men landed scattered across the desert in the pitch dark, dazed and separated from one another, with absolutely no idea where in the world they were. They began searching for each other in the darkness, firing pistols into the air, setting off flares, calling out, until one by one they found each other and gathered together as a single group. 8 survivors, standing together on cold desert sand in the middle of the night, alive, uninjured, and completely, utterly lost.
And meanwhile, behind them and above them, something almost ghostly was happening. The Lady Be Good, now completely empty, her crew gone, never crashed. With her controls still set for level, steady flight, the abandoned bomber simply kept gliding, slowly losing altitude for another 16 miles across the empty desert. Then she settled down onto the flat sand in a smooth, gentle landing, sliding across the desert floor, breaking into 2 pieces near the tail, and came to rest there, almost peacefully, remarkably intact. She would sit in that exact spot, perfectly preserved by the dry desert air for the next 15 years, a strange, silent ghost of an airplane in an ocean of sand, waiting quietly to be found. But by the time anyone finally found her, the 9 men who had flown her there would already be far beyond saving.
Let's pause again and recap, because what happens next is the part of this story that I think you'll find truly remarkable. It's now the morning of the 5th of April, 1943. 8 American airmen are standing together in the middle of the Sahara Desert. They've survived the bailout, they're together, but they have no idea where they actually are. When the sun came up that morning, the 8 survivors finally got their first real look at the place they had landed. And it must have been a bewildering, almost frightening sight. They were not on a beach, they were not anywhere near the sea.
In every direction they looked, there was nothing but flat, empty desert, stretching out as far as the eye could see. But here's the truly tragic part, and this is so central to the whole story that I want to say it plainly. Even now, standing in the middle of all that empty sand, these men still did not understand just how much trouble they were in. They believed, based on everything they'd been told the night before, that they had bailed out somewhere fairly close to the coast, perhaps 100 miles from their home base. A long, difficult walk, certainly, but a walk a determined man could realistically survive. They were not 100 miles from home. They were closer to 400 miles away, deep, deep inside the Sahara Desert, far beyond any distance a man could reasonably hope to walk on foot. And between the 8 of them, they had exactly 1 canteen of water, half full. I want you to picture that clearly. Half a canteen of water shared between 8 grown men in a desert where daytime temperatures would climb past 130 degrees Fahrenheit. They did not know the odds were truly impossible, and so they did the only sensible thing they could think to do. They decided to walk north, toward the coast, toward the sea, toward what they believed was home, and which they believed was within reach. They gathered what little equipment they had, and they set off walking across the sand, leaving behind the wreckage of their lost airplane, walking steadily toward a rescue that was in truth hundreds of miles farther away than any of them realized. And as they walked, the co-pilot, Robert Toner, remember him with his little pocket diary, took it out and began to write. His very first entries are almost businesslike, the calm, careful notes of a man who still firmly believed he was going to survive this and tell the story afterward someday. He wrote that they had gotten lost flying home, run out of fuel and had to jump. He noted that no one was badly hurt. He wrote that they couldn't find John, meaning Borovka, the bombardier, but that all the others were present and accounted for. In those first hours, there was still real hope, real order. 8 disciplined young airmen walking together toward what they believed was safety, looking out for one another, carefully rationing their tiny supply of water, even leaving a trail of markers behind them as they walked, scraps of parachute fabric, a life vest, a flying boot, so that any searchers who came looking could follow their path. But no searchers were coming, not to where these men actually were, and the coast they were walking toward was simply too far away to ever reach on foot. With every single step they took to the north, these 8 men were not, in fact, walking toward rescue. They were walking deeper into a situation that was already almost certainly beyond saving. They simply didn't know it yet. And that little diary in Robert Toner's pocket was about to record, day by day, the slow and painful fading of their hope.
What happened over the following days is a feat of human endurance so extraordinary that years later, experts who study desert survival simply refused to believe it had really happened, until the evidence made it impossible to doubt. The 8 men walked north across the open Sahara. During the day, the sun was merciless, temperatures climbing past 130 degrees, the sand throwing the heat right back up at them, no shade anywhere at all, the horizon shimmering and empty in every direction they looked. At night, the same desert turned bitterly cold, and these exhausted men shivered through the darkness with almost nothing to keep them warm. And through all of it, they had almost no water at all. They rationed that half canteen down to single, careful drops passed between 8 parched, suffering men, trying desperately to make the impossible last just a little longer. Toner kept writing in his diary, and his entries, short, plain, written in pencil, chart a slow and painful decline from hope into real suffering. The early days still carry traces of optimism, even a kind of quiet faith. The later entries grow shorter, more desperate, focused almost entirely on one single subject, thirst and prayer, and waiting for help that was simply never going to come. In one entry that has haunted readers ever since, he wrote that they were still waiting for help, still praying for it to arrive. Help was not coming. Nobody back at base even knew these 8 men were out there. And yet they kept walking, mile after mile after mile, with almost no water in killing heat. These 8 young men kept going, driven by sheer discipline, by hope, by the simple, stubborn will to live, by an absolute refusal to lie down and give up. Desert survival experts who studied this case years later concluded that men in their exact physical condition, with the amount of water they had, should not have been able to travel more than about 25 or 30 miles total, and should have died within roughly 2 days. The men of the Lady Be Good walked for 8 full days, and they covered not 30 miles but nearly 80 miles, and some of them traveled far, far more than that. At a certain point, after roughly 78 to 85 miles of walking, 5 of the men simply could not go any farther. Lieutenant Hatton, the pilot, Lieutenant Toner, the man with the diary, Lieutenant Hayes, the navigator, Sergeant Lamont, the radio operator, and Sergeant Adams, one of the gunners. Their bodies had reached their absolute limit. They stopped walking, and they waited together, too weak to continue, still holding on to the hope that the other 3 might somehow find help and send it back for them. Because 3 of these men refused to stop. Sergeants Guy Shelley, Harold Ripslinger, and Vernon Moore, the 3 who still had the most strength left, pushed on alone, past the point where their 5 friends had collapsed, in one final, desperate attempt to find help and save the others. Think about what that decision really meant. 3 dying men who could easily have simply lain down with their friends and rested, chose instead to spend the very last of their strength trying to save everyone else. And they walked an almost unbelievable distance. One of them was eventually found more than 100 miles from the spot where they had first landed in the desert. They pushed their own bodies far past what science said was physically possible on willpower alone. But the desert does not care about courage, no matter how remarkable it is. One by one, the men of the Lady Be Good lay down in the sand and did not get back up. The 5 who had stayed together died right where they had stopped. The 3 who pushed onward died alone, scattered across many miles of empty desert, each one a little farther north than the last, each one still walking right up until the very end. The diary's final entries simply fall silent after that. 9 dead men and 1 empty, abandoned airplane spread across 400 miles of some of the most desolate land on Earth. And a war raging on elsewhere that had absolutely no idea any of this had happened. If this story is moving you the way it moves me, take a moment to hit subscribe. It's genuinely the whole reason this channel exists, to keep stories like this one alive. Now let's go back to that airfield on the morning after the Lady Be Good failed to come home, and the 15-year mystery that began that very day.
Let's recap where we are. It's the morning of the 5th of April, 1943, back at the home airfield in Libya, and the Lady Be Good simply hasn't come home. She was the only airplane from the entire Naples mission that didn't return. Of all the bombers that had taken off, struggled through that sandstorm, turned back or completed their mission and come home safely, hers was the one empty space left on the airfield. 9 men and a brand new bomber, simply gone. The military naturally did what any military does in this situation. They launched a search. Aircraft were sent up to scour the area looking for any sign at all of the missing bomber or her crew. But here is where the original mistake, that wrong radio reading from the night before, quietly doomed the search effort to fail as well. Everyone involved believed the Lady Be Good had been flying home over the Mediterranean Sea when something went wrong. The obvious, reasonable conclusion was that she had gone down somewhere in the water. So the search concentrated entirely on the sea, patrol boats and aircraft combing the stretch of Mediterranean between Naples and the Libyan coast, looking for wreckage, for life rafts, for any survivors that might be floating in the waves. They found nothing at all. Of course they found nothing, because the Lady Be Good and her crew weren't in the sea.
They were hundreds of miles to the south, deep in the desert, in a place absolutely nobody thought to look, because nobody could have imagined the bomber had flown so far inland. The searchers were, quite literally, looking in the exact opposite direction from where these 9 men actually were. The 5 men who had collapsed together and waited, hoping for rescue, had no way of knowing that nobody was even searching anywhere near them. They very likely died still believing that help might appear over the horizon at any moment. After the search came up empty, the inevitable paperwork followed, as it always does in wartime. The 9 men of the Lady Be Good were officially listed as missing in action and eventually presumed dead, lost somewhere at sea. Telegrams went out to 9 American families scattered across the country, to the Hattons in New York, and to the families of Toner, Hayes, Warovka, Ripslinger, Lamott, Shelley, Moore, and Adams. The telegrams told them what little the Army believed it actually knew, that their sons and brothers were missing and presumed lost over the Mediterranean. For those families, this was about the worst possible kind of loss imaginable, a loss with no body to bury, no grave to visit, no real answers, and no true ending. Their boys had simply flown off into the night and never come home, and there was nothing left to do but wait and wonder for the rest of their lives. The war moved on, as wars do. It pushed forward through Italy, through France, into Germany itself, and eventually it ended, and the world slowly began rebuilding. The men who had searched the sea for the Lady Be Good went home to their own lives. The little airfield at Soluch faded back into the desert it had been carved out of, and the Lady Be Good herself, along with the 9 men who had walked away from her, was simply forgotten, filed away as just one more aircraft lost at sea, one more set of names on a very long wartime list of the missing. For 15 long years, that was the end of the story. A bomber that had vanished, a crew presumed drowned, a mystery with no answer, slowly fading from memory as the years passed. And then, far out in the desert, in a place almost no human being ever goes, someone finally looked down and saw something on the sand. Let's jump forward now, 15 years, to set the scene for this next part properly. In the years after the war, the world's growing demand for oil sent exploration teams searching into some of the most remote and difficult places on Earth, and very few places were more remote or more difficult than the deep interior of the Libyan desert. On the 9th of November 1958, a team of British geologists working for an oil exploration company were flying a routine aerial survey over a stretch of desert called the Kalancho Sand Sea when one of them spotted something on the ground far below. The unmistakable shape of a large airplane lying broken on the open sand hundreds and hundreds of miles from anywhere. They noted the exact location and reported it, but at first nobody quite knew what to make of it. When word reached a nearby American airbase, the response was simple confusion. There was no record at all of any American aircraft having gone down out there in the middle of the deep desert. Planes from this war had been lost over the sea, over enemy territory, over actual battlefields, not 400 miles deep into an empty ocean of sand. The report didn't seem to add up, and it wasn't followed up on right away. But the geologists kept spotting it on later flights, and eventually, in the spring of 1959, a ground team made the long and difficult journey out to the wreck to see it for themselves, and what they found stopped them in their tracks. The aircraft was a B-24 Liberator, and as they got closer, they could read a name still painted in flowing letters on the nose: the Lady Be Good. This was the very same bomber that had vanished 16 years earlier, the one everyone had always believed had gone down somewhere in the Mediterranean Sea. She wasn't in the sea at all. She was here, hundreds of miles inland in a place no one had ever thought to look. And the condition she was in was almost like something out of a strange, eerie story. The desert, it turns out, is one of the great preservers on Earth. With almost no moisture and no people around to disturb anything, the Lady Be Good had been sitting out there in a kind of suspended animation, completely untouched, for a decade and a half. The men who finally reached her described the experience as walking into a perfectly sealed time capsule from 1943. The plane was broken in two where she'd skidded to a stop, but otherwise remarkably intact. Inside, the equipment was almost unbelievably well preserved. The machine guns, after 15 years sitting out in the open, still worked, pulled the trigger and they would fire. The radio still functioned properly. There was a working thermos with tea or coffee in it, somehow still drinkable after all those years. There was food still sitting where it had been left. There were the crew's own personal belongings exactly where they'd put them, almost as if the men had only just stepped away for a moment. But the men had not just stepped away, because as investigators searched through the wreck, going over it inch by inch, they made a discovery that turned one mystery into a far deeper, more unsettling one. There were no bodies inside. The Lady Be Good was perfectly preserved, fully equipped, almost eerily intact, and completely empty. The 9 men who had flown her into the desert 16 years before were simply nowhere to be found. Not in the cockpit, not anywhere in the wreckage, not anywhere near the plane at all. The bomber had finally been found, but her crew was still missing. And now the question wasn't just where the plane had gone anymore. It was something even stranger, even more haunting. What in the world had happened to 9 men who had simply vanished into roughly 400,000 square miles of empty desert sand? Let's pause and recap here, because we're right at the turning point of the whole story. We started with an empty plane. We then went back and watched step by step exactly how it ended up empty. The wrong wind, the wrong radio reading, the bailout, and that extraordinary 8-day walk. Now we're back at the moment the plane was discovered 15 years later, and from here, the story becomes a search for 9 missing men. The discovery of the empty, beautifully preserved Lady Be Good kicked off one of the strangest search operations of the entire post-war era. A hunt for 9 men who had been missing for 16 years, somewhere out in a desert with almost no boundaries. At first, the searchers reasoned much the way the original 1943 search team had, just in reverse. Surely, they thought, the crew must have stayed close to the plane or died somewhere nearby, so they searched the immediate area around the wreck. They found nothing. The crew clearly was not there, which meant they had survived the bailout itself and had then set off somewhere on foot, away from the plane. It took until February of 1960, and once again it was oil exploration workers, not the military, who made the breakthrough. Roughly 80 miles to the north of where the crew had originally bailed out, searchers came across a cluster of remains lying close together. 5 men surrounded by a scattering of personal items, flashlights, scraps of parachute material, a flight jacket, pieces of equipment. This was the group that had stayed together and waited: Hatton, Toner, Hayes, Lamott, and Adams. And on the body of co-pilot Robert Toner, searchers found it, that small pocket diary, still legible after all these years, 8 days of pencil entries that for the very first time in 17 years finally told the world exactly what had happened to the Lady Be Good and her crew. That diary solved everything. It revealed that the crew had bailed out believing they were near the coast. It revealed they had no idea they were over dry land at all until they actually hit the ground. It described the half canteen of water, the decision to walk north, the 8 agonizing days of suffering, and finally the moment the group split. 5 too exhausted to continue, 3 pushing onward to try to save them. The men of the Lady Be Good had not drowned in the Mediterranean in 1943, as everyone had always believed. They had parachuted into the desert and walked in genuine agony for 8 straight days before finally dying of thirst and exposure. And they had carefully left a trail of markers behind them the entire way, in the hope that someone, someday, would follow it.
Armed with the diary and that trail of markers, the searchers kept moving north, following the exact path of the three men who had pushed on alone. And the distances they uncovered were almost beyond belief. The remains of Sergeant Guy Shelley were found many miles farther north than the group of five. Beyond him, even farther still, searchers found the remains of Sergeant Harold Ripslinger. These men, while dying of thirst, had walked well over 100 miles across open desert, far past the point where any expert believed human survival was even possible, all in a desperate attempt to save their friends. They never gave up. They simply ran out of body before they ran out of will. The bombardier, John Warofka, remember him, the man whose parachute had failed on that very first night, was found too in August of 1960, lying right where he had fallen near his collapsed parachute, closer to the original landing spot than anyone else. In the end, the remains of 8 of the 9 men of the Lady Be Good were recovered and finally brought home to families who had waited 17 long years to learn what truly became of their sons and brothers. 8 of the 9, because one man was never found at all. Sergeant Vernon Moore, one of the 3 who had walked on past the absolute limits of human endurance, simply vanished into the desert completely. His remains have never officially been located even to this day, though there is one haunting possibility worth mentioning. A British desert patrol years earlier may have come across human remains in that exact same area, quietly photographed and buried them right there on the spot, never realizing they had just found one of the long-lost airmen from a bomber the entire world believed had simply gone down at sea. A small diary carried in a dead man's pocket had finally solved a mystery that had stood unanswered for nearly 2 decades. The Lady Be Good had finally given up her secret. But the story still had one final strange turn left to take.
When the Lady Be Good was found, she was such a remarkable specimen, a 15-year-old airplane preserved almost perfectly by the desert, that the military salvaged various parts from her wreckage to study, and some of those parts were eventually installed in other aircraft back in active service. And this is where the story takes a turn that feels almost supernatural, even though, as you'll hear, there's a perfectly reasonable explanation behind it. Because the airplanes that received pieces of the Lady Be Good did not have happy careers afterward. A transport aircraft was fitted with several instrument parts taken from the Lady Be Good. It developed propeller trouble in mid-flight and was only able to land safely after throwing some of its cargo overboard to lighten the load. Another transport plane was fitted with a radio receiver salvaged from the wreck, and it ended up ditching in the Mediterranean Sea. And then there's the detail that, more than any other, gave birth to what people began calling the curse of the Lady Be Good. A small army aircraft was fitted with an armrest taken directly from the cockpit of the bomber. That plane crashed into the Gulf of Sidra off the coast of Libya with 10 men aboard. No trace of those men was ever found. And of the very few pieces of that aircraft that ever washed up on shore from the sea, one of them was that very same armrest. The armrest from the Lady Be Good, now connected to 2 doomed flights more than 15 years apart, washing back up out of the water as if it simply refused to stay sunk. Now, I want to be honest with you about this part. There is no such thing, really, as a cursed airplane. The military never officially endorsed that idea, and there are perfectly sensible explanations for those later accidents. Parts that had spent 15 years sitting out in scouring desert sand were very likely not entirely reliable anymore, and aircraft of that era suffered mechanical failures fairly often regardless of where their parts came from. It's almost certainly just a string of grim coincidences made to feel meaningful only because of the haunting story attached to them. But you can understand why the airmen who later flew with those particular salvaged parts were never entirely comfortable about it. And you can certainly understand why the Lady Be Good became, and still remains, one of the most famous and haunting lost aircraft stories in the entire history of aviation.
the story quickly worked its way into popular culture. When the wreck was first found, it actually inspired one of the most famous episodes of the original Twilight Zone television show, the tale of a lost bomber crew wandering the desert with a grave marker dated the very day the Lady Be Good was lost. And pieces of her endure to this day. Right now, parts of the Lady Be Good, an engine, a propeller, the crew's own personal belongings are preserved in museums across the United States, including the National Museum of the U.S. Air Force, where visitors can stand and look at the relics of a bomber that flew into the desert and never came home. One of her propellers stands today as a memorial in the small Michigan hometown of her radio operator. And the men themselves were finally laid to rest, their 17-year ordeal of simply being missing, finally, mercifully, over.
Let's take a moment before we close to look back over the whole shape of this remarkable story. A bomber that landed entirely on her own, gently in the middle of an empty desert with absolutely no one at the controls, and then sat there, perfectly preserved for 15 years, her guns still ready to fire, her coffee still warm enough to drink, waiting quietly in the silence for someone, anyone, to finally find her. A crew that survived the crash landing, survived the jump from the sky, found one another in the pitch-black darkness, and then walked with half a canteen of water shared between 8 men nearly 100 miles or more across some of the deadliest sand on Earth, all the while leaving a careful trail of markers behind them for searchers who, tragically, were looking in entirely the wrong direction. 3 men who, even while dying of thirst, chose to keep walking rather than simply lie down in one final doomed attempt to save their friends. And a small pencil diary carried in a dead man's pocket that waited 17 long years to finally tell the world the truth. The Lady Be Good is often remembered today simply as a mystery, the bomber that vanished and was later found, perfectly preserved, sitting in the sand. But I don't think the real story was ever truly about the airplane. I think it was about the 9 young men who flew her on their very first mission together, who were betrayed by a wind they could not feel and a faulty instrument reading, and who then, faced with the most hopeless situation imaginable, behaved with a kind of courage, loyalty, and sheer endurance that defied everything the experts believed was even possible. They were not the heroes of some great famous battle. They were ordinary young airmen on what should have been an ordinary flight home, who found themselves in a truly impossible place, and who walked and walked and walked and never once gave up. The desert kept them for 17 years, but in the end it gave them back, and it gave back their story along with them, so that all these years later we can still know their names and still remember exactly what they endured out there, alone, in the silence. If you believe the crew of the Lady Be Good deserves to be remembered, please take a moment to subscribe. That really is the whole reason this channel exists. And if you'd like, let me know in the comments where you're watching from today, so their story can travel just a little bit further than it did yesterday.